coming, and so we've got a good program here on the books for you guys. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Clint Laughlin. I'm the livestock extension agent here in the Midway Extension District, based out of Russell office. And this is my sidekick and colleague, Craig. I'll let him introduce himself.
Yep, well, most, I think everybody knows, have met me with either being at other meetings, but Craig Nickel. I cover pretty much anything plant related, crop production and horticulture is my program areas, and based out of the Ellsworth office. So we'll get our first speaker going. We have Keith Harmoney. He'll be going over the pasture management and that in regards to drought conditions, which, as you all know, we're definitely in the midst of a extreme drought right now, and doesn't look too good on our outlook for moisture, unfortunately.
Yeah. We'll let Keith take it away.
All right, do I need to do anything up here? Or is it already
It
good?
should be good to go.
Okay, all right.
This is where the mic is, where you're standing, so it picks up your audio.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming. Not a lot of folks here today, but I actually like small crowds because I think that you folks are more free to ask questions and things that are pertinent to you, and you're less timid and just speaking up and seeing what's on your mind, and you know, I like that. So if you have a question anytime going through this, something pops into your head really, you just speak up and we'll try to cover it for you, or find an answer, or maybe find somewhere where you can get information that'll help you. So just go ahead and speak out any time here. So I'm going to talk to you about drought and other considerations for this time period right now, in terms of pasture management. And see, it is not advancing for me.
You might have to just click.
Well, it was working.
Your battery went out at the wrong time.
Well, I just had some new batteries put in here, so. All right. So anyway, they talked about the drought conditions that we're in right now. And so whenever you're faced with a seemingly bleak situation, trying to find opportunity or some sort of optimism in the situation wherever you can. Okay. Right now, you know, the western half and some of the southeastern portion of the state in a severe drought, but try to find opportunity or something optimistic about every situation. Kind of like this person right here in the middle of the Kansas drought. This fellow looking at his field of cactus, and he's saying this time of year it would normally be a field of corn. Okay. Well, he's finding an opportunity to put some cactus in there. You know, cactus, you know, it might grow okay during the drought. Other things maybe not. Cactus, yeah. So try to find some sort of positive thing in this. Find an opportunity somewhere. And so one thing that I think we can do at this time of year with the current situations is take this opportunity to sit down and assess what our pasture situations are, pasture by pasture, and think about what condition they were in at the end of last year, going into this year. And is there an opportunity for us to make some sort of change in our management based on the condition that they're in? You know, evaluate the stocking rate and whether or not we need to change something. So that's what this picture is depicting right here. This is depicting a situation where maybe we had a drought the prior year, and so we didn't get as much grass growth as what we wanted. And so the left part of that balance beam is the part that the animal takes off, and the forage demand and the amount of family they're taking off in every bite and accumulated through the season, compared to what was produced in the year on the right. So the forage required from our grazing animals versus the forage available. And so what happens when we take off more leaf than what we wanted or desired, or what we originally had our stocking rate set for? we can get animal production out of it. We get gain per acre, but we're doing it at the sacrifice of plant energy, producing new buds the next year, soil health in the form of soil cover, because we may have less plant cover there. So we're reducing soil health, potential for runoff, which affects water quality. Okay, so when those are balanced, the forage demand from the animals and forage produced, the whole system is more in balance and has more positive effect on the whole landscape. Plus, our bottom line is usually good too. Okay. So, talking about capturing moisture, I found in that our nearly half a decade of records that we kept in our research center with pasture forage production and linking it to our weather data that we have at the center, because we're the official weather site for the city of Hayes. Linking those two together, we have a really strong relationship with well, some parts it's decided to work and sometimes it's not. We have a really strong relationship with early season precipitation and how much forage is produced at the end of the year. Actually, I think this is not going to work because it's one of those screens that doesn't take that one.
So what's the difference in the colors on the dog?
Okay, yeah, I was going to explain that, but that's a good to point that out. Okay, what that is that break line right in the middle of that graph. That is where our average precipitation is for the months of April, May, and June put together. Okay, so when we get above our average precipitation early in the year, the graph, that straight line, red straight line graph there shows that no matter how much rain we get, it's hard for us to predict how much forage we get at the end of the year. That's what that level line means, is that it's not changing regardless of how much forage we got or rain we got. It's hard to predict how much forage we're going to get.
So that's indicating in one location, you got almost 6,000 pounds on 10 inches of rain. Whereas in another location, you only got 3,500 with 15 inches.
Yes.
Am I reading that right?
Yeah, and that's the variation. When we get above average precipitation in those months, I think a lot of times the amount of rainfall we get doesn't convert directly into forage growth, because we may have such large events, some large events that happen,
And you
or saturate when we get more room. But on the left side, when we get below average precipitation, we need to capture as much as we can, because we have a really good relationship with how much forage is produced with how much rain we got. And that's what that left side is showing us, is that we have a really good relationship there.
And is that going to be representative of like a native pasture?
This is a native
perennial
pasture.
grasses?
Yep, this is native perennial pasture that we do our research on right around Hayes. Yeah, a good question. Now, those same numbers, this is saying that for each inch of rainfall we get, we're going to get just under 400 pounds of forage from our springtime precip, is what that's saying. That early season precip is really important. So that's what that equation at the very upper left is saying, that 392x, that X part is how much rainfall we get in April, May, and June combined.
In inches.
In inches, yep. And then it's then by adding out the rest of that equation, that's what our end yield will be. Now, the exact numbers aren't going to be the same at all the locations, because different environments, etc. But the relative importance is going to be the same. Like the proportion is probably going to be the same. So if you get 70% of your average precipitation for your location, the amount of yield you get is probably going to be the same proportion as the amount of yield we would get if we got 70% of our rainfall. Does that make sense?
And so would these be sites across the whole state of Kansas or just in Russell County?
This research, these data points are just for our research center.
Oh, okay.
But the proportions you could probably apply to other parts of the western part of the state.
So each little square is a different field, then,
Every square is a different year.
a different year.
Yeah, every square is a different year. And so in some of those years, like the very lowest bottom point on there where we just had just about 3 inches of precip in April plus May plus June combined. That was our driest year on record in 1956. So we had 3 inches of precip early in that year, and we had about 1,100 pounds of 1,100 to 1,200 pounds of forage produced. And our average is that other horizontal line where it goes from the white to the tan, and that's 3,400 pounds. That's the long-term average. So. Anyway, this early season precip is really important for how much forage you get.
We hear that saying. I mean, we'll call it mantra, but that same point is important even in cultivated crops. Oh, with, you talk to the no-tillers and the soil health people with NRCS and stuff, they'll make that good point.
Yes.
It's not how much rain did you get, how much did you keep?
Yeah, and this shows that. Yeah, this shows that. So anyway, need to take the opportunity to try to have our pastures in condition where they can capture that early season rainfall.
So you want grass left out there, so. Gravel.
Want to have some residual out there so that they'll cover, stop the rain impact and keep it from.
We got a golf course out there. It ain't gonna pull you right.
Yeah, you're reducing the amount of rain that you're gonna be able to capture. Yep, that's exactly right.
Those yields are dry matter.
Those are dry matter yields. Yep. Those are dry matter yields.
So roughly, you said that was 400 pounds of dry matter per inch.
Per inch. Yeah, that's what that first part of that equation there on the upper left means. Yep. Now it's going to be different for different locations in the state, but the proportions are going to be relatively similar. Okay, so anyway, talking about taking the opportunity to assess pasture condition and what the coming up year might look like, I had several people ask me, well, what should they do for a stocking rate to start this year? Because they were thinking about it. And there's a lot of different scenarios that you can come into mind, okay? Like, what condition was your pasture in last year? Was it stressed or unstressed? What's our current soil moisture status? You know, just looking at those two things, whether stressed or unstressed, and whether or not you have soil moisture or not, puts you in 4 different potential scenarios of what you could do with your stocking rate for the year. And when people ask me, instead of writing up a paragraph to send out to all these people trying to explain all these things, I thought it would be easier to make this proposed to look at. And so that's what I did. Made this flow chart. And this is the left-hand side of it. And this is if your pastures were in good condition at the end of the prior year, unstressed. And then the condition of the soil right now, looking at current dry soil or current moist soil. And then those different scenarios of what you might do with your stocking rate for the year. Well, if your pasture was unstressed last year at the end of the season, that means it's probably got ample carbohydrate reserves and it's ready to start growing this year as soon as we get precip, right? Well, if we have soil moisture, it's ready to grow right now. Okay. And so this side of the graph of this flow chart actually should take up the majority of the years we have if we're balancing our stocking rate with our forage production. It's in the cases where we have dry years that the other side of this flow chart comes into play. That's when we have prior years of stress. Okay. Now, when we have prior years of stress, in looking at all those years of data that I showed before. In looking at those years when we have a stress year due to drought, where we have less than 75% of our average precipitation. The following year, our average production is lower than what our potential could have been for the amount of rainfall we got. It's usually 10 to 15% lower. So if we got, following a drought year like this year, if we had 100% of our average precipitation, so we are right on average, we would get 85 to 90% of our average forage production. And that's due to the stress that those plants were under the year before.
So you're relating that to the months of drought from last year?
Yes, of ending the year last year without having leaf material or being under stress and not being able to store the carbohydrate needed to start to grow well this year. Or it's not produced the buds it needs to have a thick stand to start the year. You know, that prior year has some effect on this year's growth. And it's looking at the total of all the years of drought that we had. Just, it's about 10 to 15% lower than what our precipitation value is. Percentage. So say we get 70% of our average rainfall this year. That means our production is going to be 55 to 60% of our average. Okay. So it's going to be more, and in fact, it could even be more reduced than that, just because of the 2 years of stress added together. But if we have adequate rainfall this year, I would still expect that we're going to be 10 to 15% lower than what the potential would have been had we had a good year last. Does that make sense? Okay. So anyway, that's this scenario.
Just ask,
Yes.
for those of us who did lose pastures during that time. I call that a stressed year,
I would call it a stress year too, and you know what?
please.
I'm going to be talking about that in a little bit.
Okay,
I collected a lot of data on
okay.
parts of that, some pasture that went into
Because
that
what I
fire.
just heard you say, it
Yep.
makes me feel like maybe there should be no cattle put out.
So you just keep that in mind, because I'm going to be talking about that in a little bit. So it's good you brought that up, because I'm going to be talking about it. And I thought that would be appropriate for some of the folks that might come here. So anyway, now we got 10 to 15% less production than what our rainfall potential says it could be. But we also have wet winters and we have dry winters, right? We'll either start the year with moisture or we'll start it without moisture. And when we have wet winters, on average, we have a higher production year than we do with dry winters. Okay, it's a little bit higher average production. Now, we're not able to predict what our total production is going to be, because so much of our production during the year is based on that April, May, and June precipitation, right? But we know that if we have a wet winter, what we get as the end result of April, May, and June is going to be a little bit higher than what it was when we started without it moisture. Okay. And that's kind of what that 600 value was on the right side of that upper equation, that 603. That's almost like saying if we got no precipitation at all in April, May, and June, we still would get about 600 pounds of forage produced just based on the soil moisture. So that's kind of where that comes. Does that make sense? So when we have soil moisture to start the year, we are getting some increased yield. We just can't predict what that end yield is going to be.
I have a little different question, but I've always wondered, and I work with a lot of alfalfa. And of course, we're dry. But when you consider the structure of, say, the perennial grasses, and understanding that alfalfa is a problem, but you take those grasses, like say, buffalo native grass, are all the roots involved in water. Absorption, I mean, both the water, or is it more in the top 8 to 10 inches? And then the other roots are more for anchor.
Well, all the roots are gonna be involved in some sort of water uptake.
The smaller ones don't get into the smaller crevices.
Yeah, they're the ones that are exploring more. Those are the ones that that increase the total volume of soil that is
Contact.
for
access.
Yes,
Okay,
yep.
but even those deeper roots are gonna help, especially in some of these extreme conditions.
Yep,
That happen.
those deep roots will help bring moisture up as long as there's moisture there.
Well, and I was asking Craig here, I think I heard you on a webinar not long ago talk about if you take too much off the top, then you slow that root growth.
Yes, you do.
And so the top, above ground and below ground need to work together.
Yes, what you see above ground is often what you see below ground. So if you've removed a lot of the top growth, that means you've also reduced your root growth, which means that you got less volume of soil that those roots are getting into to try to extract nutrients and water. But if you have good above ground growth, that means you're also going to have good root growth going on. It's going to be exploring more soil to pull those up.
I didn't mean to get you off track, but
No, that's good. That goes along.
I've wondered that for a long time. Are all the roots looking for water as much as those ones that I normally think of as?
Yeah, all of them will be involved in. Yeah, all of them will be involved in.
Thank you.
So, anyway, so when we're talking about dry soils and having a stressful year last year, on the left-hand side up here, I have down that it would be reasonable to start out with a 15 to 25% reduced stocking rate for the current year. Because we don't have any moisture in the soil to start growth. And our grass was in poor condition or stress last year, so it's going to have low vigor. So it's not even going to really be ready to graze at the normal time this year. So automatically we're thinking that stocking rates ought to be reduced some. Okay. Now, if we have wet soil, that it's ready, the grass is got moisture, so it can grow. But it's stressed from the prior year, that's where that 10 to 15% reduction. And then looking at that May and June precipitation along with April, using that then and keeping track of it can help you decide whether or not you need to make adjustments once the growing season started. Because by the time June is done, we know what the April, May, and June precipitation was, and we can see whether or not we're close to our average or how far below average we are to make some sort of adjustment, because that's where the majority of our forage production is going to come from, is from those early months of precip. So that's basically what this is. I actually should have printed this off and brought some, but I didn't bring it in, but I can have them available and get them sent to everybody if you're interested in this flow chart.
If you want to send it to us.
Okay, sounds good. But anyway, some of the things that you can do once the growing season started and you see that you're going to be short on April, May, and June precip where you were, then that's almost a sure thing that you're not going to have the forage that you thought you were going to have to start the year. So early wane, coal opens, coal your poor performers, or things that just structurally aren't sound that you're okay with culling out. Take stalkers off pasture or replacement heifers off pasture and reallocate cow calf pairs or just cows to those acres if you've early weaned. Or just simply pull off the pasture and put your cows in a dry lot or ship them somewhere that has grass if you're able to find it. You know, all those things are options to do as ways to destock once the growing season has started. Those are probably some of the more common. So moving on, talking about loss of production from stress from drought. We also have an area of the 4 counties right around here that were in that 4-county fire. Okay, so you had some pasture that was in that fire?
Yes.
You did? Okay.
Yes.
Did anyone else in here have any pasture that was in that fire? Okay, well, our research center, we had pasture that was in that fire. Our Saline experimental range had about 3/4 of it that was in that fire. Okay, and a lot of this area was also in the fire that occurred in 2017 that went through. That fire actually started from a electric panel on an oil well that was actually on our research center property. So that fire from 5 years or from 2017. So we were directly affected by that fire as well. But this one took 3/4 of our pasture acres. But that gave us an opportunity to do a study. Right? So we were interested in the effects on the soil cover, plant population, and overall production and yield that resulted from that fire. And so we compared burned areas because the fire stopped along an oil lease road that was in the middle of one of our pastures. So we had a spot there that we could directly compare just right across the road from each other on the same basically ecological sites of the pasture, the effects of the burn. Okay, but that fire was under pretty extreme conditions, right? 100-mile-an-hour winds at some locations. So with the head fire, there were some parts of this fire where all the vegetation burned off. So there was nothing covering the soil, and the wind was still blowing 100 miles an hour. And so all the loose topsoil and all the ash blew off of those areas. And they were deposited in like low spots, cattle trails, little draws and valleys, ponds. So we have those areas of the fire. But there was a front that went through and the wind switched and calmed down. And so there's some areas of the fire that were a backfire. Where once it burned, the vegetation burned off, but all those loose soil particles, all the ash and everything was still intact. Okay, and that's why the fire stopped at our lease road on our property, was because the wind had gone down, and once it got to that road, there was no fuel on there, it stopped. And so it was a fuel break. So we were able to compare those to right across the road, a place that was unburned. So we had all three types: unburned vegetation, vegetation that burned in the backfire, and vegetation that burned in the head fire, was all on our property. And we were able to compare them. And this slide shows the location of those. The green dots on the top were the unburned. The blue dots were the ones right across the road were the backfire. And then a little over a mile away, up to a mile and a half away, was the area where the head fire went. And that's the red dots down at the bottom. And we did our comparisons all on the same ecological site. So it was basically the same soils with the same plants before the fire went through. That's what we were comparing. Okay. And we mowed actually right before the growing season on the unburned parts. Those top three up there, we actually mowed all the vegetation off so that when we did our measurements, we were only measuring new growth and we weren't measuring old growth along with it when we clipped to measure yield. So anyway, what happened with production? Well, looking at what I call the no clip, where we just let the vegetation grow on its own and accumulate for the whole season. We had about a 25% yield reduction from both the backfire and the head fire compared to the parts that were burned. So we had a 25% reduction just due to the fire going through a level. Okay, so 1,500 pounds versus just over 1,100 pounds an acre. All right, now I'll tell you that our average production on these pastures is just under 2,400 acres or 2,400 pounds an acre. So due to the drought, we were already reduced 40%. So we got 60% of our average on the parts that were unburned. Just due to the drought. So we were reduced 40%, and then another 25% from the fire going through. So as it ends up, the places that had the fire had 45% total yield of what would be average for those sites. Does that make sense? So we had the effect of both the drought and the fire. And the effect of the drought was actually more of the fire. 40% reduction versus 25% reduction. But it's still another stress onto it, right?
So and that's continuing to get worse. Now. What is it?
The effects could carry through. We're measuring all these again. So we're gonna get second year data effects of the burn. And whether or not it's a drought here, we'll be able to we won't be able to compare it to a good year other than what our average is. But yeah,
Remind me again what month that big fire.
it happened December 15th, 2021.
Okay, that was the day that terrible wind came.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Okay. I remember that day well.
Yeah, December 15th, 2021.
Okay. So that then. I mean, because sometimes we say fire was part of keeping the prairie rejuvenated. This came at the bed at a wrong time.
Yeah. Fire is part of what developed our rangelands and our prairies. That's what kept most of them tree free and grass dominated. And so fire should be part of the management and long-term upkeep of all these pastures. So fire is actually a good thing. You just don't want fire under the conditions that we have because it's completely uncontrollable.
The drought and the wind.
The wind, and the dry conditions that we have. It is uncontrollable and
so widespread and
and there's you can get some devastating effects.
well, a lot of livestock loss.
Yeah. That's
Terrible.
But fire is a natural part of the landscape and how our rangeland developed. Fire is a good thing. It recycles nutrients, keeps the landscape tree free and grassland dominated. So it's how our range developed, and so it's good to have on the landscape. We just want to do it under controlled conditions.
A lot of them guys like up in the Flint Hills, it's so dry out right now. Why are they still burning?
Some of them are burning because they actually have, there are parts of the state that have some soil moisture. So, especially in the eastern part of the state, if you have some soil moisture, their grass will pop up. As long as you got soil moisture, the grass will start to grow and you'll get some soil cover. And they're kind of counting on, I think, having some precipitation still during the growing season. If it was dry soil conditions right now, you probably wouldn't be seeing there as many. With the fire on the ground.
Yes, it's coming 3 or 4 months earlier than it should have been murdered. You can't grow.
Yeah, that's the other part of why it was that not only was it uncontrolled, but the time of year, we wanted to have the ground covered with vegetation. So when that fire was really December, there was nothing covering their soil for 4 months. And so it exposes those plant crowns to winter freezing temperatures, freezing thaw and injury. And also if we got snow, there's nothing there to hold any snow.
Yes.
Right, hold any precipitation. And when we get early spring rain, there's nothing there to hold any rainfall on the landscape. So those slopes just going to run off. And so it just came at a bad time of year because we didn't have anything growing out of the ground right away to cover the soil and stop any precipitation and keep it on the landscape. So anyway, we had production loss from both the drought and from the fire. Litter cover, litter is one thing that we need on the soil to help infiltration, stops the flow of water. Helps water infiltrate into the soil. We had less than 5% litter cover on the burned areas and just over 60 on unburned, which is pretty typical for unburned pasture to have that much litter on it. That's in the general acceptable range. Okay, so we had a big loss in litter cover. The whole to stop rainfall and to get it to infiltrate, but once we did get moisture, litter helps keep it in the soil from evaporating. Okay, basal cover of plants was reduced. It was significantly different between the head fire area and the unburned area. That's why those two asterisks in there. Significantly different between them. It was reduced between the unburned and the others, but significantly different between the unburned and the head fire. So we had basically less plant density, what that essentially, or not plant density, but less foliar cover over top of us. Or no, I'm sorry, this is basal cover, so it was basically less density. Plants.
Yeah, when you had that fire go through in 21, December 21, would you get enough grass to raise it in the spring of 22?
So we didn't put any animals on it until August of 2022. We let as much vegetation grow as we thought was going to, and then we stocked animals on it. And the stocking rate we had on there ended up being approximately 20% of what we normally would have. Yeah, so we did get a little grazing off of it, but not a lot. Because we wanted to keep some cover on there. We wanted to have some animals, but we also wanted to have some cover on there for the winter and for this coming spring. But we had reduced basal cover, and that's kind of what we saw in some places. You see some area in between grass plants. That's some of what we saw in some areas of the head fire. Okay, big blue stem cover. It was also significantly different between the unburned and the head fire. And we actually had more big blue stem in the head fire area than we did in the unburned area, which I thought was really interesting. That we had more in the head fire locations. And you'll see probably why here in the next slide. And that's because those head fire areas were very low in little blue stem cover. Little blue stem is a bunch grass. Bunch grasses are more susceptible to injury from wildfire because their crowns are closer to the soil surface. They're exposed more to the temperatures of the fire itself, plus the freezing temperatures that we have from the winter. But we had a significant loss of little blue stem in the head fire area. But in the unburned area, we had a high percentage or high cover for the blue stem. So that's why I think the cover of big blue stem was more in the head fire area. It had fewer other grasses it was competing with. So it was able to express itself. And this is what we saw in that head fire area. Those little circles are circles of little blue stem plants. And these are areas where, this is a site where we typically would see, like I showed before, 20% little blue stem on the area, cover on the area. And we just had a few plants here and there. So little blue stem cover was really reduced. And doing another form of statistical analysis between the proportions of the plants that were there and not only proportions of the plants, but the species that were there. This graph shows that it essentially was a different community after the head fire went through. The more those oval circles are overlapped, means the closer they are together to being a similar community, to be that have similar plants and proportions still. And the less overlapping there is means that they were more different. And this is showing in that blue oval that there is almost no overlap with the unburned, which is the orange. So proportion wise, a lot of the same plants may have been there, but the proportions of them were way different. That basically spread it as a different community. So that head fire did have a big effect on the plants that were there.
Does Daubenmeier have a more common name than they might like?
Well, no, the Daubenmeier is just a method to estimate cover of each plant. That's what that Daubenmeier is. That's a Daubenmeier cover. That's just a method for us to estimate in a frame, say 5% of the frame is covered by big loose end. Or 15% is covered on the frame is covered by the loose end. It's a way to estimate the proportions of each plant in a frame area. And then we look at all those frames together to get averages and estimates of what the overall plant community looks like. So it's just a method that we use to collect the data.
So when you say plant community is diverging, does that mean being a little bit more fewer species in an area, or?
A little bit of it would be that. But a lot of it is just the plants that were there were found in different proportions. Like the big blue stem was found close to 30% in the head fire area, but little blue stem was only 2%. You know, that 2% is a big drop in percentage compared to the unburned area where little blue stem is 20%.
So proportions.
So it's proportions come into play. Yeah. So the proportions are going to come into play. So that's what part of this is. Proportion and species. Yeah. But it just showed that community was different in that head fire area.
Understanding that you're seeing a lot of these things within a year or two after the fire, is it expected that it'll continue to change and ever get back to what it was?
Over time, I expect them to get back to closer to what it was before the fire occurred. It's just going to take time for it to happen. But usually after 2 to 3 years, the production level is usually the same for yield. You may just have some small differences in the proportions of the plants that make up that yield, but over time, those will probably converge and get closer together. But I just thought this was interesting to go along with the yield data. That's why I showed it. Just if you're walking out those pastures and you think that you might see a difference in the plants between the areas that have the head fire go through versus the unburned areas, it's quite possible that you are actually seeing a difference because we were able to measure it in this study. So anyway, just overall, we had a loss of dry matter production due to the fire itself. We also had a loss of production due to the drought, and the plant community was basically affected by the head fire that went through. So all those things, had an effect on what we see out there in the pasture. So
Now, did you analyze it, say the burned stuff and the unburned, how many more undesirable plants like your weeds, Canadian this and shit? What were your birds?
we did look at species differences as far as native plants versus introduced plants that commonly we see as like weed species out in crop fields. In the areas where we have these set up, that everything was burned off. And so when we put these plots out, we didn't know what would be coming back in. As far as invading species, well, we didn't hardly have any of those invaders coming into these sites. There are some areas that I saw where there were some heavier sunflower um, parts of the pasture where that must have been in the seed bank. And so in our pasture, sunflower was probably the one that came back the most, out of all the things that might be considered a weed. It's a native plant though, actually, sunflower is a native plant. But we usually don't see it in pasture very much, or in small amounts, but that was the main thing we saw. Some pastures in the area had heavier, hemp or marijuana, wild hemp marijuana come back. So that was another one of the common that I saw. We didn't necessarily have that on our pastures, but I did see some areas that did have that. But by and large, the species that we had come back were all native species. And forbs are important to the community because their rooting structure is different in grass. And so that rooting structure, they're able to mine nutrients, micronutrients and things like that from deeper in the soil profile that they bring up into their tissue. And then when that plant dies off, all that vegetation dies off and goes to the surface as litter, you know, those nutrients eventually get cycled and those are brought to the surface and spread and distributed. So forbs are important to this community. And
Was old world blue stem and more or less affected by the fire?
You know what? That's interesting that you bring that up because I'm really interested in old world blue stems. I've done a lot of work on old world blue stems. But in our pasture up there, we don't have old world blue stem in it. So I can't necessarily say what happened. I know some sites up there that do. And now that you say that, that would be interesting to go in and see what that plant density looks like.
If I could ask this, I didn't know whether it would be a good time because I just happened to see it yesterday. I mentioned in Craig, there was some burning, and I'm way down by Chase, Kansas, but in that Chase Ellenwood area, we had some burning going on in the last 48 hours. And one spot I noticed, they burned a whole big waterway that had been filled up with Phragmites. Is that a plan to burn that whole plant in the spring and hopefully kill seed?
But
Because it looked intentional because it had alfalfa in the road and other things around it.
I would say burning the Phragmites would probably be more so that if they wanted to have grazing on it, there'd be less old material there, so the animals might graze on it better. Either that or they maybe. Yeah.
Or spread it.
Spray.
Oh, spread, yeah, because it's got a lot of green shoots coming up.
Yeah. Spray landing on that whole dead material,
Right,
not gonna do
waste
anything.
of time. Okay, thank you.
And at the center, was there any, do you have any solution there?
No, we don't have any ceresia. No, the only place of ceresia that I know in Ellis County is in a CRP field that's just a few miles outside of Hayes. I don't know of any other ceresia that's in Ellis County. Right, so anyway, talking about things that took away yield this past year, the drought and the fire. Okay, another thing that takes away yield every year. Or this is a diagram that shows a percentage of yield that's taken out of pastures every year on a countywide basis. And for Russell County, it's estimated, I think that's about 3% for Russell County. That this one thing is responsible for a 3% yield loss countywide in yield. People? That's interesting. But notice how it's a lot higher in the eastern part of the state. Trees and brush. Exactly. Okay. You see how even though we may not think that we have a lot of them out here in the western part of Kansas, they are moving west. And trees and brush are responsible for, well, in the year just 2019, Just over 4,600 tons of forage lost in Russell County. Due to tree encroachment in 2019.
How much does that offset though, in a situation where they might provide shade for their livestock?
Well, that's an interesting factor. That's something.
I'm an ex-arborist. And I was a little shocked when I moved out here and saw such
Yeah,
lack of appreciation for trees.
I,
Although you have such a poor selection.
I've been, it's interesting you bring that up because I just started doing some researching some literature on studies looking at trees and shade and pasture and the effect on animal production. And in a pasture situation, there's not a lot of studies. But in a pasture situation, so far from the things that I've read, it's had very little effect on reproductive performance and overall animal gain. Now, when you get into situations where animals are more confined, like dairies and feedlots, shade had a big impact.
Oh, really?
But in pasture situation, where the research has been done so far, I haven't seen that much of
Well,
it.
you know, shade can be artificial, you know, it doesn't have to be a living tree, but.
And that's part of what I was looking up. Some of it was artificial, some of it wasn't. But I don't have any of that summarized or written up. That's just from what I recall from reading so far.
Well, you can sure, I mean, and I drive the country a lot, but I was catching my attention when I see all the cows crowding under a tree on one of those 105-degree days, you know, the sun's up there.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, I don't have a really great answer for you other than just that consensus.
Well, you can just, again, in my area, I continue to see them goes out, and, you know, and I understand. But at the same time, guys could do more to improve their pastures with weed control and getting rid of brush.
Yep.
You know, that's still gonna take moisture,
Yep.
limit grass growth and not provide any shade.
Yeah, and this is, I believe, combined. I think this is tree and brush combined. But over 4,600 tons total of forage loss just in Russell County, which at a moderate stocking rate is 46,500 cow calf pair days. That was just 1 year, 2019. So since then, we're in 2022, so 19, 20, 21, 22, multiply that by 4, just under 200,000 cow calf pair days lost. Since 2019. That's a lot of cow, that's a lot of production loss for a county. Think of what dollars that comes into for tax revenue, et cetera, for the county. You know, that's a lot of production.
If you feed your cattle mineral, the right kind of mineral, you really don't need shade for them, because like some of the minerals, like I started this Vitaferm, and they got what they call a heat mineral. And I got a few trees out there, and the ones that get the mineral, they don't really go by the trees for the shade.
And you'll find too with that vitamin that you're not gonna have the flies in them either.
No,
And
yeah,
you're-
it's still up some.
Yeah, and you do not have to use all of that intense spray that most people always seem to think would be to spray on cattle.
Yeah.
You know, and that adds heat to their body. When you do that spraying, because, you know, they don't sweat. Obviously.
Yeah, I guess I can't really add anything to that conversation. I don't have any experience with shade and treating with that with the Vitaferm, so I can't really say anything about that, but
Well, Vitaferm ain't the only one that's got that kind of
Others.
mineral. There's two.
right. Well, anyway, Russell County is missing out on a lot of production due to trees. Okay, did we have trees on the plains historically?
Not many.
Not many. That upper left picture, that's General George Custer and his wife along Big Creek in 1869. And you see in the background there, what do you see in the background of the tent?
Trees.
Trees, right along Big Creek. And that was really the only place he saw trees out on the plains, was right along creek banks. The other picture on the right, that's also taken on our research center property in 1869, in the upland area, no trees. Okay, so we did have trees, but they are almost all confined to the river and creek system. And they weren't out in the open upland areas like what we see today. This is a diagram showing tree encroachment in 1991 versus 2021, and these are acres that have, I believe it's over 5% tree encroachment on them. And you'll see from the two diagrams, from the two graphs, red is moving a lot further to the west in the state, where more and more lands are having 5% or more tree cover on them. Okay, it's estimated that in total, in 1991, there was 6.5% of pasture acres in Kansas had some sort of tree or brush cover. And in 2021, it's 11.2%.
One question for you, you got a bunch that on the 2021, you got that little area that looks like a stream or something going, is that what that is?
Are you talking about
Yeah,
this
same
little area right here?
No, up further. Up further, there's
Further
just
up
that
there?
white, the
That
white
white?
spot there amongst all the red. You got the same spot there on
Right
the
up there?
map, is that like the river?
That's a Kansas River system. That's a natural woodland, I think. So it wasn't considered as pasture area. So I think that's a natural woodland across there.
Because we actually have those.
Spots on the bottom.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yes.
So, he's just curious,
Almost about where the great end of.
how would you define tree? Is that like there are trees on it or it's ungrazable?
Where it's more dominated by trees. Okay. We had basically been converted from a dominant grassland to a tree or shrub. This area right here, those are the sand hills just north of Hutch. That red area right there. That's what this is. Okay.
And that's how they didn't even have that.
There's a rangeland area that I think is dominated by some sandy soils right north of Hutch. There's been a lot of wildfires there in the past several years. And then the red spot that's way at the top,
Yeah,
and this one, the red that's not evident on that one, but it's straight above my finger there at the top of the canvas. That's the area around Lovewell Reservoir, pasture area,
Lovewell,
around Lovewell Reservoir. Yep.
and so what, if they're just letting them grow, or there's a population center there, or?
Yeah, the trees are just encroaching, that some areas, they're becoming dominant on the pasture landscape that should be dominated by grasslands, but it's becoming covered with trees now.
I used to rent Cimarron National Grassland, that's down in Morgan County. Okay, and when I rented that, there was not a tree anywhere. I mean, you had quicksand in a lot of it, you had to be very careful with that. I was there probably about 5 years ago, and I was shocked at a lot of the trees that have come in. But they're trees like what we have here. They're the evergreen that they just need. I mean,
Yeah.
they should be cutting
trees.
Cedar
those
tree.
down and getting rid of those things.
Eastern red cedar, stay old.
That's right.
Is that what all the red stuff is on here?
It's
Cedar
a
tree?
lot of it's cedar, yeah, but there's other things included in there, but a lot of it is eastern red cedar.
Keith, how much does that do to, reduction in people that fire burns?
Well, that's my next slide. They're invaders because we've introduced the seed into new areas and we quit burning. So the combination of those two things has basically caused the tree encroachment. Planting shelter belts and things like that around homesteads and areas, you can do that. But if you have it in conjunction with a regular burning regimen, you're probably not going to see tree encroachment out in the pasture because you're going to be killing all those little trees. But when you put the two together, where you're introducing trees. Plus not burning, so you're not getting rid of those little trees. That's when you have an explosion or an increase. In what we see in tree and brush taking over areas. So it's not one that's exclusive of the other. I mean, the two combined to me are largely responsible for the big increase that we have. And it's not just cedar trees, it's other trees too, like honey locust trees. Other sorts of trees, those were introduced into parts of the western part of the state. And locust trees,
Oh,
it's a native tree, but it's mostly native to the very eastern part of the state. Honey locust.
Are those the things because,
With the long thorns.
yes,
Yeah,
oh my God.
it's actually a native tree, but it's native more eastern part of the state and eastern part of the country. But they were used for shelter belts and things like that. So we introduced the seed, plus we quit burning pasture. So when there was a little seedling out there, we had no burning regimen to stop them.
well, I was surprised, because I was a big firewood burner when I was over in Missouri. And I was surprised at the number of black locusts yet up there, and they have a shorter one of the rose like thorn.
Yep.
And that's real high BTU firewood.
Yep.
And, but,
Well,
they tend to grow and take over also.
yeah, they do. We definitely have more honey locusts than black locusts.
Yes.
The black locust is the problem.
Beautiful, racemes of flowers.
Yeah.
I mean, just
What's
see the tree.
what's the difference in looks from the black look?
They both have pinnate compound leaves. The bark is a big difference, and as the lady pointed out, the honey locust is the one that's just gonna be covered with big long thorns. And up to a certain height. That they only have those on the lower part of the trees to deter browsing by animals and deer and stuff. They're the easiest thing to tell them apart is the bark. Black locust is a lot more ridged bark, and the honey locust is a little bit smoother.
Yeah.
And that's what you've got moving in, I mean, down in our area, Ice County, is what we used to call the, it's altissima, it'll grow anywhere. It was either called a plum tree, or it'll grow in alleys, just anywhere, and it's real, and it has a stink to it. And I can't think, it's tree of heaven is the common name.
Yes, yeah.
And that's maybe the closest to a worthless tree that I know.
That's a really smooth mark on that tree.
That's what,
That's a really smooth mark on that.
yeah, real smooth bark.
Really smooth.
But it's real easy to kill with a basal bark spray,
Yes, it does.
but it takes some management.
What did you call it again?
Tree reactant. Yeah, I think that either the genus or the species is autism. But it's an invasive.
Yep,
species.
I
Does
agree.
it start like a bush? I mean, does it start like with one stem?
It'll come up from its roots and stuff, but it's not really ever like a bush.
It's suckers.
But
In my front yard.
you'll see an area half the size of this room, and they'll just be solid.
Yeah, it's suckers. It will have buds on the roots that it'll come up
And then
from.
it comes.
And it's straight, it's really straight.
That's what I must have.
It's straight.
But as he pointed out, completely ridgeless bark, smooth.
Yeah, it's.
smooth. And then it's gonna have a leaf similar to a black walnut, kind of long and pointed. But again, a compound leaf where you have that midrib and you have a lot of little leaflets off to the side.
Yep.
And how do you kill it? Just cut it and spray it?
We would cut it and stump spray it when I was in the utility business,
Yeah.
That's, I would say for a homeowner, that's the easiest way to do is, what we call basal bark spraying. Or if they're small, you can clip them or cut them. But if you don't want to run a power saw and the tree's very big, you can put triclopyr with an oil all around perimeter of it, and it'll die in a year. or two.
Yeah.
But then you got a big dead tree
Yeah.
that's gonna fall down and do some damage.
Yep. So, anyway, what are the effects of trees and brush and pasture? Well, the main thing suppresses grass growth through shading. And it also takes moisture. And those are the two main things that it does. But there's a host of other things in there. Some of them cause more dangerous wildfires to occur. In the case of cedars, if you get some top fire, crown fire going through cedar trees, that is a hot, uncontrollable fire going through the tops of cedar trees, burning. Some trees might be toxic to livestock, and like the honey locust, they can actually be dangerous to animals and the people working around them. And they're really dangerous on tires,
Yes.
really dangerous on tires, the honey locusts. So these are just some of the common tree and brush species that we have that are in this part of the world. Eastern red cedar and honey locust to me are the top two for this area. As you move east a little bit, I'd say a hedge and Osage orange would be one of the top ones. And then as you get further west, Russian olive and salt cedar, I think, would be high on the list. For brush, roughleaf dogwood, buckbrush, and smooth sumac are big players, and then yucca, which we talked a little bit about before. So here's eastern red cedar growing in a hillside of yucca plants. Not a lot of forage production going on right there. That's a lot of yucca and a lot of cedar. That's quite a bit of cedar on those hillsides there. Where do you think that picture might have been taken at?
Cedar Bluff.
It was just outside of Cedar Bluff Reservoir area on private land. It wasn't in the park part. It was actually on rangeland, private rangeland. Not far from Cedar Bluff State Park. It was in southern Trigo County.
There's a whole quarter for a little town called Raymond down southeast Illinois. There's a whole quarter that is solid. Eastern red cedar.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt it.
I mean,
Just by orange through the place.
it's a shame.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, all right, I took that last picture. I turned my head around from the road and I took the picture on the left, which is a honey locust tree growing down in the bottom of a draw, just right across the road from the other. And all those little trees up around it, those are all little suckers that when that big tree was under stress sometime, it induces new buds to start to grow and form another tree. And what?
Those little ones were the ones that really had a lot of.
They'll have a lot of
Otherwise,
function. Yeah.
something's gonna eat them.
Yep.
You know,
And there's the pod, and on the picture on the right is actually a cow pie that has about 5 honey locust seedlings growing out of it. If you're grazing a pasture with honey locusts in it in the fall, cattle love the pods. They're highly nutritious. Cattle will eat those pods, they'll eat the seed.
and
They'll
then
deposit the seed in their dung pats. And so then you've got movement from honey locust trees in the river creek area to your upland areas for everybody's out grazing. That cow patty is a perfect environment for a seedling to start. A lot of nutrients and it holds a lot of moisture when it gets wet. Perfect environment.
Well, and when you go to cut one down, there are dangers because of those soils.
Oh, yeah, definitely. But if we had a fire that went through a pasture with those cow patties with those seedlings in it, it'd burn that cow patty up, it'd take those seedlings out. Right? So they wouldn't have a chance to establish. Rough leaf dogwood, buckbrush. Another picture of buckbrush with some seeds on it. Buckbrush can actually be a pretty beneficial wildlife plant. Those seeds are used a lot by grassland birds and wildlife. But there's a point where you just don't want to see areas completely overtaken with buckbrush. And then there's smooth sumac. That's the one that gets really red in the fall. That's starting to take over hillside areas. And especially with the fire going through. Fire,
We found some, I've never had it before.
yeah, fire does not control smooth sumac well at all, and actually can increase its density.
Are you calling it new sumac?
Smooth.
Oh, smooth.
Smooth.
That's brush, not a tree, huh?
Yeah, it's considered more of a brush plant. Yeah, and then there's the yucca. So methods to control, prescribed burning. That's be the first option that I would have, be doing a prescribed burning regimen. Cutting the tree and whether or not it's an evergreen or not, would determine whether you treat it with a herbicide. Like cedar trees, if you cut it, it's done. But things like honey locust, hedge, mulberry, elm trees, all those, they'll resprout. So if you cut the tree off, you need to treat the stump with a herbicide. Okay. There's foliar treatments that you can do once they leaf out in the spring. The basal bark or stem treatment that he talked about a little bit ago, frill and girdle, soil treatments, and then browsing or biological control. So there's burning. Burning will also take care of cedar trees that are up to 5 foot tall, just a typical prescribed burn. A really hot burn could get trees that are taller, but up to 5 foot trees is pretty common. It's just a typical burn.
How easily is salt cedar controlled by your typical burner?
Salt cedar wouldn't really be controlled. It's a sprouting tree. It can sprout and come back. So
Is that a picture of it on the right? Earlier?
Back here?
Yeah.
No, that's a cedar tree
Oh.
that was in the fire.
Okay.
So the fire was hot enough that it didn't consume the leaves, but it killed all the growing points and killed the leaf itself. So that's what that's a picture of. It turned the leaves turned brown from that fire going through.
The salt cedar uses a lot of water. doesn't it?
It does use a lot of water. Yeah. Right. Now, if you cut a tree down and you want to treat the stump, you only have to treat the outer inch. I mean, you don't have to treat the whole stump. The middle part's dead wood. The outer part's the only part that's living wood with living transport mechanisms for water and nutrients. So that's the only part you have to treat.
But some trees, if the root is healthy enough, well, there's latent buds down below where you made that cut on a lot of trees, and you'll get sprouting at the bottom. So as a forester, we would always cut them a lot lower than that. And we would treat, as you say, around that perimeter, and then also the flares, which are
Yeah,
the roots you can see.
some trees are that way. Yep, and on most herbicide labels, it will actually say that as well, that not only treat the outer circle, but on some trees you may want to treat the
You're trying to get,
the root.
you're trying to get your herbicide in the candy.
Yeah.
Layer.
But on a lot of trees, just doing the outer circle, the outer part of the surface works. This is a honey locust tree that was cut down and not treated. And this is about 3 years after it was cut. And if you count, there's about 19 new tree sprouts that came up around that.
Mulberry and St. John.
Yep. Those will do the same thing. And this is another tree that was cut and it was treated, but it was treated with a herbicide that wasn't as effective as others. And we still got some sprouts coming out from around the tree from the rootstock. I found with honey locust trees, cutting the tree and treating with remedy and diesel is not nearly as effective as treating with milestone or cordon with an oil carrier or with water. Milestone or cordon with water on a cut stump is very effective on honey locust, but remedy and diesel is not. Now, if the tree is left standing and you do a basal bark treatment, remedy and diesel is more effective. Something about cutting that tree off changes the apical dominance and how things flow. And it just doesn't translocate.
There's pressure in that tree. And inside that tree is hydrophilic. It's water-based nutrient flow. And so if you've got an oil, the sap in the tree is being pressured up, it's pushing that herbicide right off of that layer that you're trying to get treated. Does that make sense?
Yeah, if you're doing the surface,
Yeah.
but if you're treating the bark too. on
Well,
the outside of
and that's where your oils would work.
Yeah, but I found it, because when we treated with remediated diesel on honey locust, we not only treated the outer rim, but we treated the whole side of the tree and the root,
Oh, I see.
the root foot area. And we still got resprouts
Oh, really?
like this. That's actually one of those trees that we treated. But when we cut and we treated with milestone or Cordon with water, we had 99% control.
Well, and, I don't know if Corteva still makes it, but they made that toward on RTU, which came in a real handy quart bottle with a pop lid. That made it real user friendly.
But it's not labeled for in a grazed pasture.
Oh, it's not.
No, because the carrier is an antifreeze. Equivalent, and antifreeze and animals do not mix well.
I said,
So it is not labeled for a pasture situation if you're breeding. But it is very effective. You're right. So this is the basal bark application using milestone with an oil carrier. We got excellent control, almost 100, close to 100%. Not quite, but close. And this is the frill and girdle method. You either take a chainsaw and you cut all the way around the tree, and then you treat inside that cut area, or you put notches in the bark and treat inside that notch. And that's another way to treat trees. Or you can do a soil treatment where you put the chemical around the base of the tree. The one thing that happens with it is you may get some death of the grass around it, because that chemical can affect the grass root as well.
are you familiar with spike?
Yes,
Does that kill grass?
it will. Yep, it will. It's water activated and it'll flow with the water in the system. And so you can actually get a gradient of grass control, grass dying down a slope from where like spike.
I usually see that along the highway, they spray around the posts on the highway sign, and there'd be dead grass all the way down to the ditch.
Yep. So anyway, I have here some common foliar treatments, some chemicals. Most all of these are in that green book back there that you can look up. But one thing to note about the basal bark treatment with the milestone and the picloram or tordon is that those are water-based herbicides, and so you really need to do a clear jar test if you mix those together to make sure that the milestone and tordon stay in solution. If they don't stay in solution, they'll separate out, and some trees you treat won't get any herbicide on it. So you really need to do a jar test to make sure that the oil carrier you're using mixes and stays in solution, those herbicides.
I used a Canva once, just once,
Dicamba?
yes.
Mhm.
And it killed all the baby pheasants. It killed all the baby quail. And it also got my neighbor's field.
What chemical are you talking about?
Are you talking about flew on with an airplane? Or
It
something?
was,
Okay. Yeah, I guess I don't know about
I just.
about killing pheasants and quail. That I don't know about.
Well, it got everything.
But drift, I could see where it might hit some susceptible crops that would be close by if it happened to drift in the wind.
Let anybody
But
use that ever again.
yeah, but if pheasants and but pheasants, quail, that I don't know.
I just.
I don't know any research on
Something
that.
in that would have. killed
By and
them.
large, most aerial treatments like that, usually have a low impact on direct treatment on wildlife like that, so I
That's what I
don't know.
But, I didn't know if maybe he still had something else in his
Yeah.
mind.
That could be a possibility, I don't know.
The use back in the flag was the drill long.
Yeah, this could have been a long time ago.
This was before everybody started really.
Yeah.
I think they didn't know that much about. Drill and
Yeah.
all that sort of stuff.
I could see it damaging some nearby crops from the drill, depending on what the wind direction, the speed were, droplet size. But anyway, the right combination of method, timing, and herbicide can really put it in tree encroachment. And that can, like, as I showed earlier, countywide. You know, for an individual pasture, it may not seem like much, but when you combine all the acreage in a county that's affected, it can add up to a lot of forage. And so, anyway, that's my presentation.